America's global leadership delivered our victory in the Cold War. The fall of the Soviet Union, one of the greatest moral triumphs in American history, ushered in an unprecedented period of freedom, peace, and prosperity. But as we reveled in the afterglow of our Cold War victory, communist leaders in Beijing were biding their time, learning from the mistakes of others and preparing to mount a civilizational challenge to America. Today, the threats to our peace and prosperity emanate largely from China. To be clear, when I describe the threat from China, I'm speaking of the leaders in Beijing, not the Chinese people who suffer under the oppression and authoritarianism of their own government. The Chinese Communist Party picked up the mantle of communist ideology and has adapted it to our times. Today, the ideology that fueled the Soviet Union is alive and well in China. The CCP views the current free and open liberal economic and democratic world order as a political and ideological threat. It wants to reshape the world in its image, centrally planned and authoritarian. A world in which the Chinese government can pick the winners and losers, where every decision isn't about helping the most people, but instead about helping the Chinese regime. The ideological mindset is important to understand because it drives CCP's actions, including right here in the homeland, threatening our economy, our people, and our way of life. They employ underhanded tactics to destabilize Western nations and further their ends. Instead of competing fairly on a level playing field, China undermines the international system. Instead of fighting on the conventional battlefield, China wages secret disinformation and propaganda wars to cripple us from within. The results they have achieved thus far should concern every American. There is a connection we must all recognize. The Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian ideology and China's maligned actions are intertwined. They share a philosophical premise, the belief that the CCP can ruthlessly pursue its ends regardless of whom it hurts along the way, be it millions of people now at risk of COVID across the globe, or China's own oppressed citizens who cannot start their families, practice their faiths, or speak their minds without the fear of swift and inhumane government retribution. But the ideology is also tied to China's strategic actions against the United States in a practical way. In the truest sense of the word, it is a totalitarian state. The centralization of Chinese political, technological, and economic power, the monopoly on resources and industry, the disregard for human rights and dignity, and their own people's fear of government retributions. These traits together make the Chinese regime a serious threat to the United States and to the entire world. This combination of qualities enables the Chinese Communist Party to undermine the values of liberal democracies, liberty and equality, honesty and transparency. And believe me, we had a lot to say about China. The threats emanating from Beijing are many. China attacks the legitimacy of our political system. Each day, Chinese operatives engage in disinformation campaigns designed to mislead the American public, pressure political figures, shape U.S. discourse in China's favor, and shift responsibility for the deadly COVID-19 pandemic to others. These operatives exploit cultural and economic ties to lobby our state and local governments to adopt pro-China policies. Beijing abuses its economic leverage to manipulate major American companies into towing the party line at the expense of truth and free expression. And as we have recently seen, they engage in espionage even at state and local levels of our government. China poses a high cyber threat to the homeland, demonstrated by continued cyber espionage against the United States government and businesses and their increasingly ability to threaten and potentially disrupt U.S. critical infrastructure. China's cyber capabilities should alarm all Americans. A cyber attack on our critical infrastructure could be catastrophic. China also intentionally undermines the strength of our economy. China is a top threat to U.S. supply chain security and a persistent source of counterfeit goods. Whereas American businesses are the world leaders in innovation, China is the world's leader in counterfeits. Chinese counterfeiters send fake medicines, contaminated cosmetics, and other defective auto parts, to name but a few, in massive volumes. And sadly, the PRC exploited the COVID crisis by sending us fake PPE, directly hurting American citizens. Foreign investment from China has also proven to be a threat, as China continues to pursue select investment in the United States to gain new technologies that it cannot produce domestically, to develop its own industrial base, and to secure access to critical supply chains. American companies are put out of business due to the unfair practices used by China, significantly harming the livelihoods of countless Americans. The hollow out and undercutting of industries that are critical to American production and employ millions is a persistent and enduring threat posed by Chinese business tactics. China exploits our academic and visa systems to advance its military and economy using a wide range of government, non-government, and private actors and platforms. For example, they use visiting professors and scholars and students to steal information or to replicate the work done here in the United States. China abuses our free market economy by stealing trade secrets, harming the very American companies and free market system that have helped to lift hundreds of millions of Chinese people out of poverty. And finally, and perhaps more close to home for many Americans, China has directly harmed the lives of countless Americans. Fentanyl and precursor chemicals from China pour into our country, often trafficked by transnational criminal organizations. In addition to this scourge of Chinese manufactured drugs that kill tens of thousands every year, COVID-19, which originated in China and has made its way to the United States after an inept, deceitful response from the Chinese government, has claimed the lives of more than 300,000 Americans thus far and has harmed millions more. Simply put, our people are suffering and dying every day because of the Chinese Communist Party. As the Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, I can tell you the plain truth. The most long-term strategic threat to Americans, to the homeland, and to the American way of life is coming from Beijing. It would be impossible to detail each and every threat the Chinese Communist Party presents to the United States, but those I have mentioned here today are some of the most egregious attacks we have seen thus far. The rise of China has come at a tremendous cost to the American people, and that cost will continue to add up if we continue to stand idly by. I cannot stress this point strongly enough. China threatens the livelihood, the prosperity, and well-being of each and every American. Your homes, your schools, your jobs, your retirement accounts, and your health are all at risk. Our struggle with China is nothing short of a civilizational conflict. In the United States, we value our liberty and independence. We value the right of self-determination. We value that individuals can come together to solve shared problems, free from government coercion. We value the First Amendment and the freedoms it protects, to say what we think and to practice our faith. We value innovation and creation over theft and mindless replication. Simply put, Americans value life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Today, it is imperative that we have a shared understanding regarding the threats we face. Only then can we come together to protect the homeland against China's actions. Unfortunately, many of the most powerful members of our society have failed to recognize this threat, or worse, have chosen to ignore it. The first priority of American leaders should be to protect the American people, not to act as sycophants or mouthpieces for Chinese propaganda. Yet too often, politicians at all levels of government have fallen short of these ideals. Corporations across a variety of sectors, many of whom are household names, bow to China's will. Major technology companies, which have seen unparalleled success thanks to our free and open economic system, have turned their backs on the principles in the country which helped foster their growth. A 2017 U.S. Trade Representative report found that Chinese theft of American intellectual property cost our country as much as $600 billion each and every year. Our responses to such behavior have been weak or non-existent. Meanwhile, our own media institutions, tainted by Chinese influence, refuse to report on this threat. Even worse, sometimes American media itself is a platform for CCP propaganda. Entertainment media has also fallen under China's trance. Today, major Hollywood production companies and directors sometimes censor products to please Beijing in the hopes of tapping into the Chinese market. China's ability to compromise the most powerful institutions and companies and politicians in our country highlights the threat posed by Beijing to the rights and freedoms of everyday Americans. This threat requires a swift response. Otherwise, 5, 10, 20 years from now, we'll look back and ask, how did we allow this to happen? As I conclude, I want to reiterate an important point. The Chinese Communist Party's ideology and China's recent maligned actions are linked. This allows them to coerce their entire population, many of whom are innocent and unwilling, to launch attacks against the United States and other Western nations. They simultaneously attack the legitimacy of our political system, undermine the strength of our economy, and directly harm or kill American citizens. The communist threat we unwisely believed was behind us in the last century is not a ghost of the past. It continues to stalk freedom and liberty today in the form of the Chinese Communist Party. And it is clear and present danger we cannot afford to ignore for the good of our country, our way of life, and our civilization. Thank you.